Hey UX community, so we are back at it here with the second installment of my creating a design system from scratch series. I think we're going to cover color styles and font styles today, which will add on to the grid styles that we did in the first video. At the end of the first video, one of the things that we talked about is saving out a library for your team to be able to access. And once you have that library saved out, you can kind of see it here. One of the things that I forgot to mention that I'd like to mention real quick is that your library gets published out as whatever your file name is. So just something to be aware of. In our current setup, where I work, we currently have this called like design system, right? And so if you are going to publish this out as your design system, just be aware that the library gets published out as whatever the file name is. So it's not abundantly clear initially that that's what happens, but you can see I changed the name of this file and the name of the library also updated to the name of the file. So we'll leave that at design system from this point forward, just as a sort of a reminder. But now anything that we publish out of this file is published under the design system library. So just something of note. And then I wanted to jump on into, I've been creating these sort of things for the YouTube channel, these sort of YouTube cover files or whatever, if you will. So I thought, we can go ahead and just take a screenshot of one of these to help us, sort of quickly and easily build a color palette. Makes sense to use a similar color palette to my YouTube channel style for this, I suppose. If you're working for some company and building this design system for a company, you'd want all of those elements to match, or you might be saddled with with an existing sort of branding that you would have to work with or whatever. So we'll assume that this is the branding we have to work with in this particular scenario, and we'll create a color palette and a font style and everything that would work with this brand. So we'll just go ahead and go in here and just start sort of selecting some colors. Whoops, I accidentally did that on the background. Let's not do that on the background. Here, we'll just create a shape. And, as with anything, like I religiously adhere to my grid, even if I'm doing a tutorial like in this case or whatever I'm doing. I always like to make sure that I adhere to the grid. It's just a good habit to get into. And so now you'll get to see why we created that little 8-pixel vertical grid. That gives us the ability to snap to these in little 8-pixel increments, and we can snap to the columns as well. So that just gives us the ability to organize via the grid in a very simple manner. So we'll just go ahead and create several of these. Or actually, you know what? Here, let's do this, because this is kind of the way that I like to organize my design systems when I'm creating a design system. Is I kind of do, I do each thing in its own page, sort of, each important component in its own page. So maybe we'll leave the grid there, and then maybe we'll create another page called colors, and then maybe we'll create another page called fonts, or something like that. Like I would start to organize this in some manner that that makes sense to me and my team in terms of the way that the design system will be laid out. So I would literally probably do this in this kind of a fashion. So let's go over here and let's go ahead and choose our circle tool. And then we'll just duplicate this out a few times, and then we'll set up the colors on here. And then what I would probably do is, you know, if we were doing this for a design system, is I would try to make sure that I've got equal spacing in here, so everything's spaced by 24 in on both axes. Now when we select this, we can jump in here and just grab the color picker, and I would probably do this initial row, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe the initial row is kind of our primary colors. And then we're going to keep this one really simple for the sake of time. So just so that I can keep you guys moving on all this different stuff. I mean, you'll get the idea. So we'll say that's primary. And then we'll say this bottom row is, you know, maybe the bottom row is all of our sort of neutrals, you know, where we might have a few different gray tones. And then I initially sort of, when I'm doing this color setup here, you know, is I'll rough out some color ideas like this oftentimes, or I'll pull in a palette that I'm kind of already thinking about, and I'll rough that palette out. But then I want to start thinking about how I'm going to start using these colors. First, let's go ahead and set up all the styles of the colors. So right now we've got the colors set up here, but they're not set up as styles. So very much like we did with the grid styles, you'd want to go in here and set up a style for each. So you go in here and you just click color styles you see here, and you just go ahead and click create style, and whatever you have selected, whatever color you've got selected is what the style will be created from. So this, you can see it's got our purple selected, so we could say here's something else to keep in mind when you're creating these styles. One of the really cool things about the way that Figma functions is Figma recognizes slash naming, and there are some other naming conventions and stuff that it recognizes in all of its input areas. So because it recognizes slash naming, you can start to think about organization a little bit here. So let's say we wanted this top row to be our primary colors. So we could say primary slash purple. And we create that. And then we might want to go to the next one, and then we want to create another style here. I don't know why I keep clicking the wrong button, but we'll just have some fun with that for a bit. And then here we might want to say primary again slash blue. And now what that does is that now if I deselect, so let's say go outside of any of your canvases or any of the areas, you just click somewhere here on the blank stage. Now you'll start to see that we're building a style library. We've got our main grid layout from the first video, and then we've got our color styles here, and we're starting to build a color library. And you see how by using that slash naming, it's now grouping these into some, you know, we've got an organization that's starting to happen here by using slash naming. So now here we might want to call this one, you know, we might want to call this one secondary slash green. And then, you know, for this guy, we might want to say neutrals, dark gray. You could even start to put sort of definition around this a little bit if you wanted to, like background color or something like that, you know, however you want to do this. You can also add other information to these through the style areas. So neutrals, dark gray, for example. Since I'm not the best speller in the world and I don't want to have to keep correcting myself there, let's just copy that. And we'll say neutrals, medium, dark gray. Neutrals, medium, light gray. Neutrals, light gray. And then just for the sake of having it, let's go ahead and make one more. Well, let's change the color first. So now let's say we wanted to change this color after we've applied the style. You'll have to unlink the style and then we can go in here and change the color. And in this particular instance, I'm going to make this a white. So then we'll add this into the styles where we'll say neutrals and we'll say white. Now, what I would probably do is, for the sake of all of these tutorials, I'm going to keep all this sort of in dark mode for you guys. So we'll just select all of these canvases here that we've got, and we'll go ahead and we'll add those to a style. So then once we add these to a style, if we want the layout to be a little more obvious, you know, some of these you might want to put, you know, some kind of a stroke around or whatever you might want to put. You know, whatever, a white stroke around that, or, you know, I probably wouldn't do anything that harsh, but, you know, something of that nature. And then let's clear the grids so we can see what it looks like. And then you can see we're starting to build sort of a color palette. And then we have all of those colors here organized by the subsections that we created with that slash naming. So we've got that all going with the colors. Over here, we've got, you know, everything going with the grids. And what I usually do for my actual grid layout page is I usually turn the grid on, and then I usually create like an actual little vector version of the grid that can be viewable in prototype mode. So I would just do a duplicate version of this grid like over the actual grid itself. So I'm not going to create all of that now, but just to show you, like I would basically snap to this grid, right? And I would build this whole grid out in a vector form for the purposes of having it be displayable through prototype if I wanted to, you know, make this public facing or something of that nature. I otherwise, you know, you wouldn't necessarily have to do this, but if you want this to be public facing, you would need a viewable grid, because there's no way to allow the public to see this behind the scenes grid as far as I'm aware of. If anyone knows differently, feel free to leave me a comment on how you can do that, and I can stop making these grids manually each time. But then I always try to make sure with anything I'm doing, even something like this, like grid, right? I always try to make sure that I'm always creating one of my, you know, one of my styles, that I'm always using one of my styles, and that I'm making sure that those styles are applied appropriately. So now what I mean by that is if we play this page as if it were a prototype. So now if I had this displayed as a grid page, you can actually see the grid structure. Whereas if I were to play this page with the grid on, you'll see you can't see the grid. So that's what I mean by the public facing version of the grid, right? So I do that for anything that I want to be public facing, like for documentation purposes or that kind of thing. When it comes to a design system, you want to do plenty of that for the team and make sure that things are documented appropriately, so that if people have questions, you don't end up answering those questions a million times. You just send them to your public-facing version of your design system. I wasn't going to go all the way through this and make you guys watch this, but now I kind of feel like I have to. It's the UX guy in me can't leave things undone. So you can see why we created those grids too. You see how easy it is to duplicate things and to snap things to it, and to you know. So that's the whole point of like making sure you've got that grid structure in there and making that right to start, because once that's in there and functioning properly, it'll make your life a lot easier. So now we have the sort of public-facing version of the grid in here where we can actually view that as a prototype, and we could put some documentation in here explaining the columns and the vertical 8-point grid setup and all of that type of stuff. And once we put the documentation in here, you know, then that makes sense. So you can see we've got something unassigned here, so I always like to go back in and make sure that everything's got an assignment of some form or another. So that's all neutral white. That's all neutral white now too. So everything is assigned, and then we've got the background as the dark. So anyway, now you're starting to see we're starting to build some structure. We've got a grid page, a color page now. We could do a font page. And again, for the sake of time, I'm probably not going to define everything I would define, right? Like I would work together with the dev team on this to determine what was needed. And you know, we can make some guesses here at a few things. Like let's say we wanted to define an H1. And here's something that starts to get kind of important as you start to build out your structure here. So you'd want to choose some typeface, and let me remind myself of what typeface I was using here, and we'll just use that so that we can keep it easy. Gotham. Okay, so I'm using Gotham as my typeface in this particular instance, so let's just stick with that here. And then I usually like to, let's say I'm going to do an H1, and let's say my H1 is going to be, you know, I don't know, 32 point or whatever. I like to usually do all of my sort of different versions of this H1 too. I like to give myself options. Oftentimes I'll try to give myself plenty of leeway by saying I'm going to do an H1 bold, or, you know, maybe even a black. I don't know, probably an H1 not black, probably an H1 just bold. And then I might do an H1 that's medium. And then I might do an H1 that's you know, light or book or whatever the sort of lightweight version of this is. In this particular one, it might be light. For something this large, I would probably call it light for an H1. And then for smaller text, I might not go down to light. I might just do regular there. Here we might want to do book or medium. Yeah, let's do medium. So there's a nice variance between the three of those now. for your H1. But here's the important thing to note. We went through all the trouble of setting up this grid correctly. So here's what we want to do is that we want to make sure that we're kind of thinking about that 8-pixel grid as we're setting up our font styles too. So we probably want our font styles to also be, to also work with that 8-pixel grid. So you want everything to be divisible by 8 to work with this grid. Now, we have the fonts currently set up at 32, which is essentially divisible by 8, but it's not aligning perfectly to the grid, you'll notice. And the reason it's not aligning perfectly to the grid is because we have the font size set, but we do not have the line height set. Right now the line height is set to auto, so it's going to set to whatever the typeface is forcing it to. So you're going to have to go in here and you're going to have to set up your line height too. If you want this to match to the grid, you're going to have to say, okay, I want this to be, instead of 37, let's make it 40, would make it match. So now you can see it's aligning to your grid. And so you want to consider your line height along with your font size. And if you don't do this, you're going to end up having to go back and redo it at some point once you get to the point where these types of details start really mattering. You'll end up having to go back and make a bunch of edits, and which don't ask me how I know that, but yeah, that's a lesson I learned the hard way. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that I needed to manually set the line height to be able to work with the 8-point grid, and I had to go back and do a bunch of rework on my font styles. So that's just something to be aware of. And then just like anything else, when you're done getting all this set up, you might want to set up all your H1s, right? And then you might want to go in, let's just go in and duplicate all of our H1s, and let's say we're going to make our body copy. So we'll just call these bodies. And again, for the sake of kind of speeding this along, we're not going to do a ton of these. We're going to just do an H1 and a body copy, but you could go through and do them all, right? H1, H2, H3, H4, body. You might want to create a font style for links. You might want to create a different font style for, whatever you can think of. We have multiple font styles. Like we've got our font styles for all of our basic copy, and then we've got font styles for links, and then we have a totally different setup of font styles that are font styles for code windows, because we do a lot of code display in our applications that we're working on. So we have a monospace type that's got its own styles for doing any type of code display. So those are all the types of things you want to consider, and then go in and set all those things up in here. And then for the sake of this, let's just say maybe let's say we want it to be divisible by 8. So let's say our main body is going to be maybe 16. And then again, I don't know, this light might be getting a little too light at that smaller size. So we might want to go to book there to make that feel a little bit softer and a little more legible on a dark screen like this, like we're doing. And then medium's probably okay here. And then bold is probably okay here. We'll call this one, for this one we'll do black, and then for this one we'll do bold, and so we'll change that to bold. And just again, because some of these minor variations in these weights are much more noticeable at a larger font size, if you're wondering why I'm kind of noodling on that. So the difference between bold and black is super noticeable here. When you get down here to the smaller size, it's not as noticeable, and sometimes the bold can look too close to medium at smaller sizes. So I like to use black in that scenario to give me and the team plenty of variance here, especially when you're doing, especially when you start getting into like data viz and that kind of thing, where you might be trying to, have some inline sort of differences in the way that you're writing copy to clearly demarcate something in your data viz layout or whatever. So it starts to become, really important when you start getting into really technical stuff. So here I would say, I don't know what the auto would be on this, but you know, you could say, I don't know, what's 24 line height look like? That's not too bad. So that's all divisible by 8 and looks a little more reasonable. So if we were to go to a second line of copy here, that's got enough of a break in it. That's got some nice spacing in it to allow it to breathe a bit and to allow it to be good and legible. So that conforms to our 24 point, and then in here we're looking at 16 on the spacing, and here we probably want to be, you know, probably 16 on that spacing too. So now that we have all this set up, now we can go in now we can go in and just like we did with the color or with the grids, we could go in and set up these font styles. So we could say H1 bold, H1 medium, H1 light, body black, body medium, body book, and honestly, you can name these whatever you want. You don't have to name them this way. This is just kind of my method, and it's something I'm just used to doing, and so it's just habit at this point. And then same thing with the text styles too. If you wanted to use that slash naming convention, you could go in here and you could use the slash naming as well. So we could say, like, if we wanted an H1 category, we could do like an H1 slash in here. I believe, I believe that will, if you edit it there, it will add the, yes, and it does. Okay, so the other thing that's interesting about Figma that's pretty cool is Figma does a lot of, like they've been very smart about the way that they've constructed the application, and oftentimes you can do batch things. So yeah, add new folder, that's interesting. So I guess if we call that H1, it would merge. So see the way that you can batch things in Figma? Like Figma oftentimes gives you the ability to batch things, and quite often I forget that it gives you that ability, and I forget to try doing things in this manner, like where you're doing it in more of a batch style. So you could do this where you could organize these things by H1 and by body and, you know, that kind of thing, which, you know, is super handy. But, you know, it's just, I don't know, like, you know, I'm really kind of a little bit of a fanboy of Figma at this point, and, you know, obviously, or I wouldn't be doing a YouTube channel and creating tutorials and all that on it if I didn't enjoy using it so much. But yeah, I mean, think about, you know, where you can do like batch settings on things and stuff like that. Try to remember that, because that's something that I forget quite often. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm working in Figma now. I can there's probably some way to batch this out and do it in a different way than the way that I'm currently doing it. So, and then if you want to turn these grids off and on quickly and easily, if you select any of these things, you just hit Control G. Will turn your grid off or on. I like to obviously, you know, have my grid on when I'm laying things out, but then I like to, you know, turn it off and on quite frequently and just sort of check and make sure that I'm keeping everything aligned, but also making sure that it looks good when the grid's not on as well. So I think, again, I will probably cut this here and you know, in an attempt to try not to have these turn out to where they're getting too long. I want to try to keep these like pretty short and pretty you know, quickly digestible. And then, you know, as we get into the next version, I'm not exactly sure what the next one's going to look like or what subject matter it's going to entail yet, but maybe we'll cover off, maybe we'll start some discussion about components. Maybe we'll do like a button component or a simple component and then start to get into more complex components from there. So I think the next one, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Let's cover off on buttons, maybe like that'll start to introduce us to components and that kind of thing. And because now that we're kind of got an idea of how styles works, you just want to go in and set up all your styles initially, but then as soon as you're done setting up all these styles, then you have all the base elements that you need to start to be able to think about components and how to structure those. So we'll get into that next, and yeah, I think that's going to do it for this one, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Cheers.